Hello, everyone. I'm Kathy Colverson from the University of Florida, and I would like to welcome you not only to the ECHO conference virtually, but also to the presentation I will be giving on integrating gender into livestock systems. Why should I care? So I'm looking forward to talking with you and opportunities to discuss the content of this presentation later. I'd like to start by asking you a question. Many times we see these terms used interchangeably, but I'd like to ask you, what is sex? And then, what is gender? I'll give you just a minute to think about these things because we see them used interchangeably all the time, and they really do not mean the same thing. If we look at the actual classic definitions of what is sex and what is gender, sex is the actual biological differences between men and women, concerned with our bodies, also concerned with the chromosomes that we inherit when we are born. They are generally the same throughout the human race. Gender, on the other hand, refers to socially given attributes, roles, activities, and responsibilities that are connected with being born either male or female in a given society. The interesting thing about gender roles and stereotypes is they are changeable over time. They are learned. They are not something that we are born with. And they have wide variation within and between different cultures. So remember these definitions as we move through the presentation because it's important to consider the importance of gender. How does gender affect the work that we do in the countries that we work in, particularly as it relates to agricultural development? Well, gender roles, as I mentioned, are dynamic. They change over time. Just think about your lifetime and how you've seen differences in what men and women do, what boys and girls aspire to. They also differ significantly by local contexts. And this is influenced by such things as culture, religion, education, caste, and a variety of other variables that affect how gender stereotypes are played out. As I mentioned, they are definitely shaped by some of these different factors, and it's important to consider these when we do the work that we do within agricultural systems. The most important thing to remember about gender, aside from the fact that we are not born with this, we learn it, is that it's a key determinant of the distribution of resources and responsibilities between men and women, which are often unequal and inequitable in countries we work in around the world. I just wanted to show you this slide to give you a sense of the percentages of women and men that work in the agricultural field. If you notice, we're talking about the entire African continent when we look at the percentages on the left. And approximately 50-50 are the allocations of men and women's roles in agricultural systems. Now, this varies tremendously by country. Some countries are higher, some countries are lower. If we look at the right-hand side and we look at South and Southeast Asia, we see that technically there are fewer women involved in agriculture, but you notice that Latin America is missing, as is the Middle East. And I have done quite a bit of work in Latin America, and one of the things I find really interesting is that if you ask women, do they do agricultural work, they will tell you, no, I don't. I actually am doing housework when I'm doing such things as raising a garden or raising small livestock or marketing at my house or elsewhere in the market. So it's important to understand not only the context, but to understand the terminology when people say, do you work in agriculture? So let's talk a little bit about some of the implications of the term gender and the agricultural systems that we work in. As I mentioned, and you saw in the graphic, women supply 43% of all agricultural labor in low and middle income countries across the world. And at least 50% of this in the different countries that we work in sub-Saharan Africa. But one thing to be aware of, and I'm sure many of you are already, is that women farmers face many constraints associated with their ability to actually be successful in agriculture. And these include things to do with agricultural inputs, services, and markets. And when I talk about inputs, I mean supplies, I mean access to extension services, veterinary products, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a variety of other things that women farmers need to contend with because of their multiple roles in society, where they are not only responsible for productive responsibilities, such as farming, but also reproductive responsibilities, such as pregnancy, child care, and house care, and also community responsibilities, such as things to do with caring for elders, attending church, and being responsible for school activities for their children. But be aware of the fact that also women frequently have limited control over assets and resources, particularly associated with land. Very few women in the world have title to or own land. They also, not always, but frequently have lower levels of education. And when I speak of this, I'm talking about things such as literacy and numeracy, so that when we create training materials or we do training with women who have lower levels of education, we need to be aware of the fact that we need to limit the amount of text that we use more graphics, and more participatory and hands-on demonstrations associated with training. We also need to be constantly aware of the fact that women have greater domestic care responsibilities across the world, including the United States, and we need to think about issues associated with child care and with timing that they need to be home to attend to their families, either through meal preparation or other activities that they are responsible for. We also need to understand, because of the fact that they are frequently more tied to home activities than males, they may have fewer social ties that allow them to hire in people to work on their farms, if they have farms, or to actually be involved in waged employment themselves. As I mentioned previously, they have less ownership of land, but they also have less access to credit because they frequently do not have collateral to demonstrate that they are good for credit in different institutions. So you will see things such as microcredit loans being established with women's cooperatives specifically to allow them to have access to the funds that they need to be successful in agricultural enterprises. As I mentioned previously, they also have less access to agricultural extension services. Worldwide, most agricultural extension providers are male. They frequently do not believe that the women are doing productive agriculture or are farmers in the first place. And if the women have to travel any distance from their home with young children to be able to access these services, it is very difficult for them. So it's important to recognize this when we create and conduct training programs, that we allow women to be able to have the opportunity to attend. Women also face constraints in their ability to make decisions within households and their ability to act upon these decisions. And we call this agency. So if they lack agency, they don't have the ability to act upon decisions that they may be involved in making or may not be involved in making. And this is particularly important when we look at livestock, associated with not only livestock production, processing, but also the sale of the products and the incomes that are generated from these activities. Frequently, women will do a lot of the production, and in many cases also the processing, but won't have access to or control over the incomes that are generated. And we know from research that if women don't have access to or control over the incomes, then the family doesn't benefit as much. We also need to understand that when we look at governance in different countries that we work in the world, that there are many legal systems set up that do not allow women to really participate fully in decision making or be able to participate fully in other aspects of governance. So this is something that's important to understand. We also need to recognize that in many countries in the world there are customary rules around who owns land, how the land is managed, are women able to hold title, and if not, then they don't have demonstration of any kind of collateral they can use when it comes to accessing credit and financial support for their agricultural enterprises. One of the other things that we need to consider that has been taking place for many decades now is what's called the feminization of agriculture, where women actually are receiving more responsibility associated with small agricultural enterprises because of the fact that the males are migrating elsewhere to look for paid employment. And this is probably one of the biggest issues that we see not only in Latin America, but also in other countries we work in the world. The women are left behind not only to maintain their already existing domestic responsibilities, but also to pick up additional responsibilities associated with farming. In Bangladesh, when the men migrate, women take over the duties, which also increases their workload. Sometimes they will hire other people from outside to assist if they have access to the ability to hire additional labor. The other thing to be cognizant of is that in many places in the world that we work in, and I'm thinking particularly of Rwanda, where there was a pretty horrific genocide 20 plus years ago, is that we see places in the world that have wars and other types of disruptions. And in Rwanda, men were traditionally responsible for milking cows, but when the genocide took place, the women then became responsible for doing this because of the shortage of male labor. Interestingly enough, I've done quite a bit of work in Rwanda. Young boys are often brought in to do the milking if, again, the woman has access to that type of labor. Other things to consider, many places of the world where males have migrated, they send money home in the form of remittances. And it's a very, very high amount of money, according to the World Bank, and these numbers are a little bit dated. But in different places in the world, it is a significant percentage of the GDP that goes back into the countries. But the interesting thing from a gender perspective is that men and women will spend these remittances differently. For example, in India, remittances from female migrants are mostly allocated for savings, education, and medical treatment, while those from male migrants are primarily used for expanding business and doing loan repayments. The other thing to consider in the Philippines is remittances that were sent home are used by the husband to purchase more land, though this decision is often resisted by the women because it increases their workload. So it's something else to consider, is that if money is being sent home and it's spent differently, who is most affected by those remittances? So what about gender and livestock systems? We've been talking about the different aspects of constraints that women face, but how do we actually deal with this in the work that we do? Well, something to understand is that women and children are concentrated primarily in smaller livestock species, chickens, goats, and sheep. And these species have less earning potential because they are smaller, but they also have less costs and inputs required for starting a business enterprise. And they also have shorter lifespans, which means that they can be processed or slaughtered much more rapidly than larger livestock species. In some locations, women have the ability to control the income that is generated from the outputs, particularly as it pertains to eggs and milk, but they may not always have the final decision on how the income is spent. So this is a big issue in almost every project that I'm involved in, and that others who are involved in gender and agriculture to really look at ways that we can consider how do we increase the decision-making capacity of women and their ability to control income. When men control the income, the household doesn't always benefit fully or equally. But when women control the income, family, nutrition, and health generally benefits. The women will spend up to 90% of their income on their families, while men will spend 30 to 40%. And this is well documented if you're interested in references on these details. Something else to consider that is impacted by gender stereotypes is the global burden of foodborne diseases. I have been involved in a number of different projects in East Africa, particularly associated with who bears the brunt of foodborne diseases. And if we look at the effects on the left graphic, we see that 1 in 10 people will fall ill. 33 million healthy life years are lost if we look at the substantial impact that foodborne diseases have. And if we particularly look at the African region on the right graphic, we will see that 1/3 of the global death toll is due to foodborne diseases. And particularly we're talking about things such as salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, and other diseases that are particularly found in animal-sourced foods and dairy products. So this is something to be very aware of because it also has very strong gender implications. Women are responsible for a lot of the production, particularly of smaller livestock species, as we mentioned. They are also predominantly responsible for the food processing of animal-sourced foods and dairy products. And so they are exposed much more frequently to these organisms and frequently do not have the knowledge and the background to understand how best to deal with foodborne pathogens. So some of the things we need to consider, you can see the graphic on the right. You see this woman is chopping up what looks like a rabbit in fairly unsterile conditions, but these are quite common in the places that we work in the world. As I mentioned, women are very involved in all different aspects of livestock production and particularly in processing. They are responsible for home food preparation, which exposes them much more frequently to food safety hazards, particularly around livestock, which may have contamination from feces. They may also have unpasteurized dairy products, which is not uncommon in many places in the world. And these all transmit foodborne pathogens. They are then often transmitted to the family, and young children are particularly affected by this, diarrhea and other types of intestinal diseases. If there is a lack of food safety knowledges or running water that is also safe. There are many places in the world that we know that don't have access to safe running water for use in processing of animal products. So what can we do about all this? One of the first things that I suggest to people is to think about what are the gendered roles in the livestock systems we work in by conducting a gender analysis. And a gender analysis is nothing more than processes that make visible the varied roles of women, men, girls, and boys, and looking at how they interact in the community and with other types of structures in their society. It's not difficult to do, so we're going to talk about this real quickly. Basic steps. It's basically kind of like 5 W's. Who does it? The activity that we're talking about. Is it the production? Is it the processing? Is it the transportation? Is it the marketing? Is it an adult woman or man, female or male child, or some other relative, grandfather, grandmother, or aunts or uncles? What are they doing specifically? Are they milking? Are they feeding? Are they weeding? What kind of agricultural activity or livestock productive activity are they doing? When do they do it? What time of day? Early morning, midday, evening, and the time of the year, because we need to consider the seasonality of different agricultural cycles. We also need to think about where they are doing this activity. If it's a woman with young children, is it near the household? Is it in the village? Is it in the community center? Et cetera, et cetera. And the thing I'm often interested in is why are they doing the activity that they're doing? Are they doing it to earn income that they can actually control? Are they doing it because it's a gender stereotype role that they've inherited through their cultural constraints? So these are basic steps associated with any kind of gender analysis. And so who, what, when, where, and why. So conducting a gender analysis of a livestock system, we need to think also about who's benefiting from this project and how do they benefit. Are these benefits going to be shared equally among all family members, or do certain members gain more benefit than others? How will the project affect the workload? Particularly, are we looking at women that there are going to be additional responsibilities added onto their already cumbersome schedules? Are all family members affected equally by food safety risks? If not, who is most affected? What would you like to see as the outcome of this project as it relates to gender and nutrition equity within the household or the community? So I always start with that at the very end and say, this is what I want to see. So how do we go about doing that, being cognizant of the previous page associated with the gender analysis questions, as well as these questions here. So when you think about creating a project, because many of you are working on different projects around the world, we need to kind of look at what's called a project planning cycle, where we start with a situational analysis. We decide who does what, when do they do it, why do they do it, where are they doing it, and then we look at what we would like to see, what would be the outcome of this project. if we're going to be creating greater gender equity, greater access to income, greater equality within the household. And then we design program activities accordingly and make sure that we are very cognizant of all those questions that we have asked. And then we implement and we monitor. Are we actually achieving the desired outcomes? And evaluate and adjust based on what we're seeing in the project. And I always say to people, don't wait until the end of your funded project. Make sure you're doing this on a regular basis because there may be adaptations. In fact, there usually are adaptations that are necessary in any project work that we do. So keep this in your mind because this is an important thing to use when you are actually doing project planning. One of the things I also use periodically is what's called a seasonal calendar. There's lots of tools that are out there. You can find a lot of these online. And they talk about the month where something's taking place. They talk about the activity, and these can all be adjusted based on the type of work that you're doing, whether it's livestock, whether it's crops, or whether it's some other form of agricultural activity. Very useful thing to look at when we're trying to figure out when is best to initiate a project. We can also use what I use frequently called the 24-hour clock, where we look at what do men do during a 24-hour period and what do women do during a 24-hour period. And I have a great exercise, I think I have the references at the end of the presentation here, to talk about how do we actually do this if we have the men do the women's clock and the women do the men's clock, and then compare and discuss. Usually we have a lot of fun with that exercise, and the men are frequently shocked at how much work the women are actually doing. The women are generally not shocked on the reverse. So I really encourage you to consider using this tool. Recommendations. What can we do besides what we've discussed thus far for improving gender integration? Well, if we're particularly going to involve women more actively, we need to consider what time of day are we meeting and where are we meeting. And we also need to think if they have young children, are we going to be able to provide childcare? Well, if you've done the exercise previously on the 24-hour clock, you can narrow down some times which are potentially more convenient for women to attend, since their schedules are usually much more full. You also need to think about locations. Are they close to where women can walk to? Are they safe? Do they need male approval to be able to attend? We also need to consider the cultural context. In some instances, I will feel comfortable starting off immediately with mixed sex groups where we have both men and women in a meeting. But in other contexts, it's much more important to have single-sex groups where we separate the men and women, and we train the women to actually build some of their confidence and empower them to feel more comfortable speaking in public in mixed groups. We also need to make sure that if we're doing any kind of project work, as I've mentioned previously, that we look at what the division of labor is currently between men and women, and so that we don't add additional responsibilities or work to women's schedules, because that will then almost inevitably doom the project to failure. We also need to think about ways continuously that we can reduce women's workload through appropriate technology. Energy-efficient cook stoves are a great example of this. Other kinds of simple mechanical technologies to reduce the amount of drudgery that women experience around the world. Additional recommendations, as I mentioned, thinking about other types of technology. For those who have access to internet, and this is not always common, the use of mobile phones has really helped in different places in the world for women to access information about marketing, about prices, and connect them with other buyers. I've been involved in projects in various places in the world where this has been very successful. We also need to look at ways to increase their access to credit because they frequently don't have collateral. They don't have the training and strategic assistance that is needed for them to be able to fill out the forms. So it's really important to think about, can we provide access to microcredit or other ways that women can access the resources they need to be successful in their businesses. We need to also consider ways to engage men more actively in non-traditional activities, such as nutrition and health, which are frequently seen as women's responsibilities, even though they affect the entire family. I'm involved in a number of projects right now which are really looking hard at how do we engage men and boys more actively, specifically in nutrition in the household. So happy to discuss that later if anybody is interested. We also need to look at ways to work with extension providers, such as yourselves, to explore innovative ways that we can train additional female extension workers and also provide the resources that women who frequently cannot attend trainings will have the ability to do so. I want to thank all of you very much for listening to my presentation, and if you are interested in more information, please feel free to contact the Livestock Lab with all of the addresses above, and I am happy to answer any questions later in the program. Thank you very much.